If I looked at your credit card statement from the last 12 months, there's a good chance I could predict what your financial life will look like 10 years from now, without knowing how much you earn, without knowing where you work, without knowing your age. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it isn't. There are purchases a man makes only once. And then there are purchases that, without him even realizing it, slowly start to define who he becomes. And the most dangerous part is that quietly they turn into a pattern that almost never gets noticed. It doesn't look irresponsible, it doesn't look impulsive, and it doesn't even feel like a mistake. In fact, it's usually praised, accepted, and even encouraged. That's exactly why it goes unnoticed. And you might be trapped in this pattern without even realizing that this behavior is shaping your financial future far more than your salary, your investments, or even your ability to make more money. And there's an even more uncomfortable truth. Almost every man believes he would never fall into this trap until he realizes that a significant part of his own money has been spent in ways that this pattern demands. That's why in today's video, I'm going to show you 10 purchases that, when they repeatedly appear in a man's life, reveal a mindset that makes building wealth much harder. But more important than the list itself, you'll understand why these purchases have so much power, why truly wealthy men rarely follow this path, and what they replace these decisions with to keep increasing their wealth year after year. If you want to start seeing money the same way as men who actually build lasting wealth, subscribe to the channel. What you're about to discover today will probably make you question purchases that, until now, seemed completely harmless. There's a belief about money that almost every man learns without even realizing it. The idea that the difference between a rich man and a broke man simply comes down to how much money each one can afford to spend. It seems completely logical. The man who earns more buys better things. The man who earns less buys whatever he can afford. End of story. But what if that explanation is completely incomplete? What if some purchases aren't just the result of not having wealth, but one of the very reasons that wealth never gets built in the first place? That possibility changes the entire conversation. Because if that's true, then the problem isn't just how much money someone makes, it's how that money is being used long before real wealth ever exists. Maybe that's why some men spend their entire lives working hard and still end up in the exact same financial position, while others manage to build wealth without having to work nearly as hard to get there. That leads to an uncomfortable question. Could certain purchases reveal far more than just someone's personal preferences? Could they reveal the way a man thinks about money long before they reveal the size of his bank account? Because if that's true, then maybe there are everyday spending decisions quietly preventing millions of men from building wealth without them ever realizing it. And the most surprising part is that those decisions rarely feel like mistakes when they're made. In fact, most of them feel completely normal. So the real question is, why do so many intelligent men keep making the exact same choices? That's where this story starts to get really interesting. Most men believe their purchases say a lot about who they are. I chose this because it fits me. This is my style. It was my decision. And most of the time, that feeling seems completely genuine. But there's one question almost nobody ever asks. Where did that preference come from? When did a particular object suddenly start looking appealing? Because preferences don't appear out of nowhere. They're built over time by the people we admire, the environments we spend time in, the stories we consume, and today, more than ever, by social media, where millions of images compete every single day to define what looks successful, desirable, and worthy of admiration. Without realizing it, many of us as men spend years being exposed to the same symbols, the same standards, and the same messages, until at some point, we stop distinguishing between what we truly want and what we've been taught to want. The interesting part is that this process is so subtle that it still feels like a completely personal decision. It feels like freedom. But maybe many of those choices were already made long before you ever thought you made them. And if that's true, maybe the most important question was never, what does a man buy? Maybe the real question is, what is that purchase actually trying to represent? Before I show you anything on this list, there's one important idea we need to make clear. This video has never been about demonizing objects. No product by itself has the power to make someone rich or poor. The exact same item can end up in the hands of two completely different men and represent two completely different decisions. Imagine, for example, that two men buy the exact same thing. One buys it because it solves a real problem, fits comfortably within his budget, and doesn't interfere with his long-term goals. The other buys that same item because he believes it will project a certain image, earn approval, or make him feel like he's finally reached the next level. On the outside, the purchase looks identical, but financially, the two decisions couldn't be more different. That's why the real indicator has never been the object itself. The real indicator has always been the intention behind it, because the way someone uses money says far more about how they view wealth than about how much money they actually have. And there's something interesting about that. Certain spending patterns appear so often that they stop looking like coincidences. They begin to reveal a very specific way of making financial decisions, a way of thinking that, when repeated over many years, often makes it much harder to build wealth, even as income continues to rise. The problem is that these patterns are so common that almost nobody questions them. They simply become part of what feels normal, part of what every man does. And that's exactly why so many people spend decades repeating the same choices without ever realizing the long-term impact those choices create. So, as you go through the next examples, don't try to decide whether the object itself is good or bad. That's not the important question. The real question you should be asking is, what kind of mindset does this purchase usually represent when it keeps showing up throughout a man's life? Because that's the pattern that often separates men who only appear successful from those who actually build lasting wealth over time. Now that we've established that the real issue was never the object itself, it becomes much easier to look at the following examples the right way. Let's start with one of the most common ones: luxury clothing covered in oversized designer logos. Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Balenciaga. For many men, these pieces represent a sense of achievement, almost as if they're finally carrying visible proof that all their hard work paid off. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with appreciating quality. The problem is that, in many cases, the greatest value of the item stops being the craftsmanship and starts being its ability to be recognized by other people. Men who build wealth over decades usually value quality, durability, and discretion far more than oversized logos, because their goal is no longer to signal wealth, it's to preserve it. Another very common example is sneakers bought purely because of hype. Jordan, Travis Scott, Yeezy, limited edition Nike collaborations. The appeal comes from the idea that if it's rare and everyone wants it, then it must automatically be worth buying. But in many cases, the real motivation was never the sneaker itself. It was the feeling of belonging to an exclusive group. When a purchase depends more on how difficult it is to get than on how useful it actually is, it usually says far more about validation than necessity. Then there are cosmetic car modifications: oversized wheels, loud exhaust systems, LED lighting, spoilers, flashy wraps. They're usually marketed as personalization, as a way to make the car reflect the owner's personality. But there's an interesting detail. Most of these modifications increase the amount of money invested in the car without increasing its market value in the same proportion. In practice, your wealth keeps shrinking, while the appearance keeps growing. Another pattern that shows up constantly is upgrading to the newest iPhone Pro or Ultra every single year. Not because the old phone stopped working, but simply because a newer version was released. Marketing makes it feel like keeping last year's model means you're somehow falling behind. The reality is that in most cases, the current phone is still an excellent device. The upgrade happens far more to keep up with Apple's release cycle than to solve an actual problem. Then there are professional-grade hobby purchases that never become real habits. Golf equipment, fishing gear, photography equipment, camping gear, home gym equipment. The excitement at the beginning makes it feel like buying the best equipment will automatically increase commitment. But the opposite often happens. Many men buy the identity first. Only afterward do they discover that they still have to build the habit. And many times that habit never comes. Another interesting example is collectible knives, swords, or limited edition tools. They're often marketed as assets, as something that's guaranteed to appreciate. But reality is very different. Without deep knowledge of that specific market, most of these items never behave like real investments. They're still consumption, just wrapped in much more sophisticated packaging. Another common pattern involves expensive bottles of whiskey or tequila purchased mainly to impress others. Macallan, Clase Azul, Don Julio, 1942. These are excellent products, but very often the real value of the purchase lies far more in the reaction it creates than in the experience of the person actually drinking it. When the main purpose of a purchase is to be noticed, it stops delivering only enjoyment. It starts buying approval. Then come flashy men's jewelry, thick chains, bracelets, fully iced out rings. Jewelry has always been part of human history, but there's a difference between appreciating an accessory and using it as your primary proof of success. In practice, these pieces often represent visible wealth far more than accumulated wealth. Then there are the products that go viral on social media: massage guns, cold plunges, desk organizers, EDC accessories, gadgets that seem absolutely essential, until 2 weeks later when another video introduces the next must-have item. The algorithm creates a need that simply didn't exist a few days earlier. And when this happens repeatedly, consumption stops following personal priorities. It starts following trends. And perhaps one of the most dangerous examples of all, watches purchased because they're going to go up in value. We're not talking about extremely rare timepieces purchased by collectors who genuinely understand that market. We're talking about men who buy almost any expensive watch believing they're making an investment. What usually happens is that these purchases remain luxury consumption. They've simply been renamed investments, so they feel financially responsible. Do you notice what all of these examples have in common? None of them are inherently wrong. None of them by themselves prevent someone from becoming wealthy. The problem begins when this type of decision turns into a consistent pattern. Little by little, money stops flowing toward things that increase your net worth and starts flowing toward things that increase the feeling of immediate reward. That's why this list was never about objects. It has always been about the mindset behind them. And maybe at this point, you've reached a very simple conclusion. All right, then I'll just stop buying these things. But if it were really that simple, why do so many intelligent men keep falling into the exact same pattern year after year? Understanding that is what truly changes the game. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you next. If this were simply a matter of logic, this video would end right here. But the problem is that these purchases rarely compete with logic. They compete with something much deeper, because almost none of them are sold as just products. They're sold as the feeling that you finally made it, that all your hard work over the past few months deserves to be celebrated, that you're moving forward, and that changes the decision completely. Because at that moment, you're no longer comparing the price of the item to the money leaving your bank account. You're comparing that item to the feeling you believe it's going to give you. That's where so many men end up repeating the same cycle and continue making poor spending decisions. Not because they don't know how to do the math, but because in that moment, the brain stops treating the purchase as a financial decision. It starts treating it as an emotional reward. And there's something interesting about all of this. Our brains are wired to respond much more strongly to immediate rewards than to benefits that won't appear until years later. The satisfaction of buying happens now. The wealth that same money could have built doesn't show up until much later. And naturally, our brains place far more value on the present than on the future. That's why resisting feels so difficult. You're not just saying no to an object, you're saying no to a feeling you could experience immediately. At the same time, you're saying yes to a benefit you still can't see. In the short term, that trade almost never feels fair. Another factor makes this even more powerful. Every small reward creates the desire for the next one. After a while, the purchase stops being an exception. It becomes part of your routine. There's always another justification. I've worked hard. I deserve it. It's been a tough month. It doesn't make that much of a difference. Individually, none of those thoughts seem dangerous, but repeated over the years, they create a pattern where spending becomes the primary way to celebrate achievements, relieve frustration, or simply feel like you're making progress. And when that happens, money stops being just a resource. It becomes an emotional tool. That's exactly when building wealth begins to lose momentum, because a growing portion of your income gets used to satisfy short-term emotions, while long-term goals are constantly pushed further into the future. Maybe that's why so many people believe wealthy men simply have more self-control. But most of the time, that's not what's happening. They've simply learned to pursue a completely different kind of reward, a reward that doesn't disappear a few days after making a purchase. And that leads us to the most important question in this entire video. If they don't find satisfaction in the same rewards that most ordinary men chase, then where exactly do they find that sense of accomplishment? I have to admit that after everything we've covered so far, you might be left with a wrong impression that men who build wealth simply don't like spending money. But that's far from the truth. They spend. And, very often, they buy excellent things. The difference isn't in the quality of what they buy, it's in the order they choose to buy it. This is one of the biggest differences between men who spend their lives trying to look successful and men who actually build wealth. While some men ask, with the money I made this month, what can I buy? Others ask a completely different question. How can this money work for me before it works for someone else? It seems like a small shift, but it completely changes where that money ends up. Because before upgrading their lifestyle, they focus on increasing their ability to generate income in the future. Before buying more comfort, they buy assets. They buy investments. They buy ownership in businesses. They buy resources that will continue producing money long after the purchase has been made. And there's a simple reason for that. They understand that every asset they acquire today reduces their dependence on their own labor tomorrow. It's like hiring invisible employees. Every investment quietly goes to work every single day, even while they're sleeping. But the mindset doesn't stop there. Once that foundation starts to exist, they begin buying something else that almost nobody notices: time. Because time is one of the few resources that can never be replaced. That's why many financially successful men don't hesitate to outsource tasks when it truly makes sense. They delegate operational work. They hire specialists to solve problems that would otherwise consume hours of their day. To someone looking from the outside, that may seem like just another expense. But for them, it's often an investment, because the time they've freed up can be used to grow a business, or simply to make better decisions instead of constantly putting out fires. Another purchase that's incredibly common among men who build wealth is something that almost never gets attention on social media: knowledge. They invest in courses, books, training. Not because they believe information alone solves every problem, but because they understand that new skills increase their ability to create wealth for decades. Another great example is one of the most interesting purchases successful men make. It's almost invisible yet incredibly valuable. They buy liquidity. Most people never think of having cash readily available as something worth investing in, but men who build wealth often see it that way because opportunities rarely announce themselves in advance. A business being sold below its true value, a great real estate deal, or even an economic downturn that creates incredible opportunities for those who are prepared. Men who have already committed all of their money to consumption rarely have the flexibility to take advantage of those moments. Those who have preserved financial margin can move quickly. All of this shows that men who build wealth don't stop consuming. They simply change the sequence. First, they make their wealth work. Then they allow that wealth to fund a growing portion of their lifestyle. The comfort still comes, but it no longer depends on the next paycheck. In reality, they've simply chosen to delay some rewards in order to gain something much greater later. And when you look at that decision over 10 or 20 years, it stops looking like just another financial choice. It starts telling the entire story of the life that man has built. Because in the end, every purchase leaves a mark. The only question is, 10 years from now, what will your choices say about you? Imagine for a moment that you could travel 10 years into the future. You walk into your house, you open your closet, you look inside your garage, you open your drawers, you turn on your computer, you check your bank account, then your investment account. Everything you see will tell a story. And what story will those choices have written? Some of those possessions may still be there. Others will have long been forgotten. Many will have completely lost their value. Some won't even work anymore, but every single one of them will represent a decision that, at one point, felt important. At the same time, another story will have been unfolding quietly in the background. The story of what those decisions allowed you to build or prevented you from building, because no purchase ends the day you pay for it. It continues creating consequences long afterward. Some expand your possibilities, others simply take up space. And it's fascinating to think that two men could look at their lives 10 years from now and see completely different outcomes without being able to point to a single decision that changed everything. Because most of the time, it wasn't one big decision. It was the quiet repetition of hundreds of small ones. So maybe the most important question has never been how much money passed through your hands during those years. Maybe the real question is this: when you look at everything you've accumulated, will you mostly see objects? Or will you see a life with more choices, more peace of mind, and more freedom to choose your own path? Think about that. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one challenge. The next time you're about to buy something, don't just ask yourself if you can afford it. Ask yourself what that decision says about the man you're becoming. That one question can completely change the way you make spending decisions from this point forward. Now I'd love to hear from you. Which example in this video made you rethink the way you use your money the most? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely enjoy reading your thoughts and experiences. If you believe more men should learn how to build wealth instead of just looking successful, share this video with someone who could benefit from this conversation. And if you enjoy content that challenges conventional thinking about money and teaches you how to think like people who actually build wealth, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We've got a lot more important topics to explore together.